My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 29 years old, and I live in Chicago, Illinois. For 5 years I showed up early, stayed late, and carried responsibilities no one else wanted. I believed hard work spoke for itself. I believed loyalty mattered. But one meeting, one sentence, from the man who controlled my paycheck, shattered everything I thought I knew about respect, power, and patience. What do you do when your boss looks you dead in the eye and calls you useless, in front of people who once respected you? Do you argue back? Do you quit in anger? Or do you stay quiet and let time do the talking? What if I told you the same man who laughed at me, the same man who said I'd never move up, was walked out of that building 3 months later while I was still sitting at my desk? How did that happen? And what did I do that changed everything? The meeting was supposed to be routine. One of those Monday morning check-ins where everyone pretends to listen while mentally planning their escape. I walked in with my laptop, a notebook, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you did your job right. I had stayed late all week preparing reports that weren't even technically my responsibility. I'd fixed errors that would have embarrassed the department. I thought, naively, that effort still counted for something. He arrived late, of course. My boss always did. The room shifted the moment he walked in, like oxygen had been pulled out and replaced with tension. He didn't sit right away. He stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, eyes scanning faces like he was deciding who deserved to breathe. When his gaze landed on me, it lingered just a second too long. The meeting started normally enough. Numbers, deadlines, complaints disguised as feedback. Then he sighed, loud, theatrical, and said my name, not kindly, not casually, the way someone says a word when they've already decided what comes next. He pulled up my report on the screen, not to praise it, not to discuss it, to dissect it, sentence by sentence, slide by slide. He questioned choices he had approved himself. He asked why certain data wasn't included, data he had explicitly told me to remove. Each question wasn't really a question. It was a setup. I tried to answer calmly, professionally. I kept my voice steady even when my hands weren't. But every response seemed to irritate him more, like my composure was an insult. Finally, he laughed. Not a friendly laugh, a sharp one, the kind that slices instead of warms. He leaned back in his chair and said it, clear, loud, unnecessary. Honestly, sometimes I wonder what you even do here. You're useless. The room went silent. No one looked at me, no one defended me. Pens stopped moving, screens froze. In that moment, I felt something heavy press down on my chest. Not just embarrassment, but disbelief. He didn't say it privately. He didn't say it constructively. He said it in front of people whose respect I had spent years earning. I felt my face burn, but I refused to let tears give him satisfaction. I nodded slowly, like I was processing feedback instead of absorbing humiliation. Inside, though, something cracked. Not broke, cracked. And cracks let light in, or something darker out. He continued talking as if nothing had happened. Moved on to the next agenda item. But for me, time had slowed. Every second felt stretched. I could hear my heartbeat louder than his voice. I became hyper-aware of everything. Someone shifting in their chair, the hum of the projector, the faint buzz of my phone vibrating with a calendar reminder that suddenly felt irrelevant. When the meeting ended, people rushed out. No eye contact. No, you okay? No quiet support, just avoidance. Because in corporate life, empathy is a liability, and association with the weak is dangerous. I packed my things slowly, giving myself a moment to breathe before standing up on legs that felt like they might give out. As I walked back to my desk, I replayed the moment again and again. Not what he said, but how easily he said it, how comfortable he was stripping me of dignity because he could. That word followed me like a shadow. Useless. It echoed in emails I typed, in spreadsheets I opened, in the reflection I caught in the bathroom mirror. That day, he passed by my desk and said nothing. No follow-up. No explanation. Just silence. And somehow, that silence was louder than the insult. I went to the restroom and locked myself in a stall. I didn't cry. I just sat there, staring at the door, letting the reality sink in. This wasn't about performance. This wasn't about mistakes. This was about power. About someone who needed to feel taller by making someone else feel small. I thought about reporting it. HR, compliance, policies. But I'd been there long enough to know how those stories usually end. Complaints turn into labels, labels turn into stalled careers. And somehow, the person who speaks up becomes the problem. So, I made a different choice. I went back to my desk. I opened my laptop. And I worked, not to impress him, not to prove him wrong in words, but to observe, to document, to understand how someone who calls others useless manages to survive in a system that pretends to reward competence. That meeting didn't just humiliate me, it clarified something. It showed me exactly where I stood, and exactly who he was. And when someone shows you that, you'd be foolish not to believe them. He thought that moment broke me, that I'd shrink, that I'd lose confidence, that I'd either quit or fade into the background. What he didn't realize was that public humiliation has a strange effect on the right person. It doesn't make them loud, it makes them precise. And that was the day I stopped trying to be seen and started preparing to be undeniable. I didn't announce anything. I didn't make a dramatic promise to myself in the mirror. There was no movie-style moment where I clenched my fists and swore revenge. What happened instead was quieter and far more dangerous. I sat at my desk that afternoon and realized something uncomfortable. Reacting emotionally would give him exactly what he wanted. He thrived on reactions, on dominance, on knowing he could shake people and still walk away untouched. So I chose silence, not the weak kind, the observant kind. I smiled when spoken to. I nodded in meetings. I met deadlines. On the surface, nothing changed, but internally, everything shifted. I stopped seeking his approval, stopped explaining myself more than necessary, stopped volunteering information that could later be twisted against me. I became careful with my words and surgical with my actions. Every email I sent, I reread quick. Every task assigned verbally, I followed up with written confirmation, not aggressively, casually, polite enough to look harmless, clear enough to leave a trail. I started keeping copies of everything, not because I planned to use them, but because I understood how quickly memory becomes selective when power is threatened. I also started watching. I noticed how often he took credit for work he didn't do, how he deflected blame with charm and volume, how he avoided details but loved summaries, because summaries could be manipulated. I saw how he spoke differently to executives than he did to us, softer, smaller, almost insecure. That was important. I began arriving earlier, not to work harder, but to listen. Conversations in the office before meetings were more honest. People vented when they thought no one important was around. Patterns emerged, missed approvals, rushed decisions, deadlines set without understanding scope. And slowly, I realized something that shocked me. He wasn't running the department. The department was running despite him. I took on extra tasks, but only the kind that exposed processes, not just outcomes. I learned systems others ignored. I documented workflows no one had bothered to formalize. When someone asked for help, I gave it, but I made sure communication looped wider than just the two of us. Visibility without arrogance, competence without noise. At home, the silence continued. I didn't rant to friends. I didn't replay the insult out loud. I let it sit, let it harden. Anger burns fast when fed, but discipline burns longer when controlled. Weeks passed. He didn't notice the change. That was the point. He still spoke over me in meetings, still dismissed my suggestions, only to repeat them later as his own. I let him. Every time he did, someone else noticed. Because when you stop fighting for credit, people start paying attention to consistency. I also noticed how often he contradicted himself. One meeting he'd demand speed, the next perfection. One email he'd approve something. Days later, deny he ever saw it. I stopped correcting him publicly. Instead, I started asking clarifying questions, innocent ones, that forced him to commit to positions in front of others. Just to confirm, you'd like this version sent to leadership, correct? He'd nod, smile, agree. And later, when things went wrong, the room remembered. I didn't gossip, I didn't vent, I didn't recruit allies. I let truth do that work for me. Because truth doesn't need persuasion, it just needs time. Some nights I questioned myself, wondered if staying quiet meant accepting disrespect. But I reminded myself, silence isn't surrender when it's chosen. It's positioning. By the second month, subtle shifts began. People started coming to me directly instead of going through him. Not because I asked them to, but because answers came faster, clearer, safer. Managers from other departments CC'd me on emails that technically weren't mine. Executives asked follow-up questions to my reports instead of his summaries. He noticed, but misunderstood. He thought I was trying to outshine him. The truth was simpler. I was outlasting him. He grew sharper, shorter, more irritable. Power feels slippery when it starts to slide. He interrupted more, blamed harder, took longer lunches, missed small details that mattered. And every time he stumbled, there was documentation. Not dramatic, not accusatory, just there. I never once mentioned the word he'd used on me. I didn't need to. His behavior was speaking louder than any complaint ever could. That silent decision, to observe instead of explode, to build instead of boast, changed the trajectory of everything. It kept me invisible long enough to become essential. And in corporate spaces, that's the most dangerous combination of all. Because when someone believes you're harmless, they stop protecting themselves. And that's when the truth finally has room to breathe. By the third month, I could feel the atmosphere changing, even if no one said it out loud. The office still looked the same. Same desks, same coffee machine, same morning greetings. But underneath it all, something had shifted. The confidence he used to carry so loudly was thinning, and in its place was tension, the kind that makes people overcompensate. I started noticing how often leadership requested updates. Not broad overviews, details, metrics, timelines, accountability, the kind of questions that expose weak foundations. And every time those key questions came up, his answers got longer but said less. He spoke in circles, leaned on buzzwords, and blamed unexpected challenges without naming a single one. That's when I understood something important. Pressure doesn't create flaws. It reveals them. Projects began to slip, small things at first, missed follow-ups, delayed approvals, unclear instructions. He tried to control everything, which only created bottlenecks. Instead of empowering the team, he micromanaged outcomes he didn't fully understand. And when things went wrong, he looked for someone to pin it on. Someone quiet, someone labeled useless. But this time, the story didn't stick, because I had receipts. Not dramatic proof. Not a smoking gun, just clean, professional records showing who approved what, when decisions were made, and how often warnings were given and ignored. When issues came up, I didn't point fingers. I presented timelines, facts, calm explanations that didn't sound defensive, because they didn't need to be. Leadership noticed the contrast. While he grew louder, I grew clearer. While he rushed, I slowed things down just enough to make them accurate. I stopped offering opinions unless asked. When I was asked, I answered directly. No fluff, no emotion. Just solutions. Then something unexpected happened. An executive asked me a question in a meeting. Not him, me. It was a simple question about a project risk, one he should have anticipated. I answered without hesitation. Explained the issue, the mitigation plan, and the expected outcome. The room nodded. Someone took notes. He sat there silent for just a second too long. That silence said everything. After that, I was pulled into more conversations. Not officially promoted. Not announced. Just included. Strategy calls. Early drafts. Side meetings where real decisions were made before they were ever presented as final. He wasn't always there. And it showed. Without me patching holes quietly behind the scenes, his gaps became visible. He missed deadlines executives cared about. He sent emails with incorrect figures. He contradicted data that had already been circulated. By me. Each mistake chipped away at the image he'd built so carefully. He tried to reassert control, scheduled more meetings, demanded reports he didn't read, questioned people publicly again, but this time, the discomfort in the room wasn't directed at the team, it was directed at him. People had started to see the pattern. The turning point came when a major client raised concerns, not accusations, concerns. Leadership asked for an internal review. Nothing formal at first, just clarity. He panicked, over-explained, shifted blame downward, mentioned names that didn't align with the paper trail. Mine didn't come up, because every decision I touched had been documented. Every risk flagged had been acknowledged. Every deliverable tracked. When leadership compared notes, my work spoke for me. Calmly, consistently, unarguably. I wasn't praised. Not yet, but I was trusted. And in corporate life, trust weighs more than charisma ever will. By the end of that month, he stopped calling meetings as often. He started closing his office door. He stopped making eye contact with me in the hallways. The man who once called me useless now avoided my presence entirely, not because I'd said anything, but because deep down, he knew. He knew the narrative was slipping out of his hands. He knew the system he'd relied on to protect him was now watching him instead. And he knew that when attention turns quiet and focused, outcomes are already decided. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I just kept working. Because when the truth starts moving on its own, the smartest thing you can do is get out of its way and let it arrive exactly where it's meant to land. He started changing in a way that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just that he was making mistakes. He was becoming visible in the wrong way. When someone is protected, they can act without consequence. But once that protection starts to crack, they begin acting like a person who knows their time is running out. He became aggressive. Not just to me, but to everyone. He snapped at co-workers in hallways. He raised his voice during meetings. He began blaming people for things he couldn't control, as if fear could be disguised as leadership. His posture changed too, shoulders tense, jaw tight, eyes darting like he was always watching for the next threat. And it wasn't only his behavior that changed. The atmosphere around him shifted. People stopped laughing at his jokes. They stopped seeking his approval. They stopped kidding around in meetings because it was no longer safe. When someone asked a question, it wasn't met with a friendly answer. It was met with a warning. You could feel it. He was trying to reassert dominance the only way he knew how, by making others afraid. That's when the cracks became impossible to ignore. Executives started asking for details that he couldn't provide. They wanted specifics, names, dates, decisions. He had always been good at sounding confident without offering anything concrete. But confidence only works when it's supported by substance. When substance is missing, confidence looks like arrogance, and arrogance looks like a liability. One day, a senior manager pulled me aside after a meeting, not in a dramatic way, no fanfare, just a simple question. "Did you know about the delay in that project?" I told the truth. Yes, I flagged it 2 weeks ago. I emailed about the risks. I asked for approval to move resources. I didn't get a response. He nodded slowly, then asked, "Did you see his response?" I had. It was vague. It was dismissive. It was exactly the kind of message that would protect him while leaving everyone else to clean up the mess. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to, because the senior manager's expression said it all. The next week, the pressure escalated. There were more meetings, more urgent updates, more emails that sounded like panic disguised as urgency. He was trying to control the narrative, but the narrative was already slipping. People began to talk, not openly, but quietly, in the way people talk when they're trying to figure out if a sinking ship is worth staying on. They asked each other questions like, "Did you notice how he didn't answer the CEO's question? Did you see that email chain? Why did he say the deadline was met when it clearly wasn't?" I stayed out of those conversations. I didn't need to participate. My work was already doing the talking for me. Then came the day he finally snapped. He called a meeting and tried to intimidate everyone by acting like the boss he wanted to be. He raised his voice. He threatened consequences. He said things that were inappropriate, unprofessional, and frankly desperate. He tried to humiliate people the way he humiliated me, hoping to regain control through fear. But fear only works when the people around you are afraid of you. By that point, no one was. The room was tense, but not with respect. It was tense with pity. People didn't want to be on his side anymore. Because they could see he was losing. They could feel it. They could smell it. And then, the final blow. One of the executives asked him a question about a decision he'd made months ago, one that had already been documented by the team. He couldn't answer. He stammered. He tried to rewrite history. He tried to make it sound like the decision had been made by someone else, but the paper trail was there. The email chain was there. The timeline was there. And suddenly, it wasn't just his behavior that looked weak, it was his credibility. When credibility goes, power follows, and in corporate life, credibility is everything. That's when the shift became undeniable. People started looking at him differently, not as a leader, but as a problem. And when a problem becomes too big to ignore, the company doesn't fix the problem. It removes the problem. That's when I knew the end was near. Not because I wanted it to be, but because I could see it unfolding with the same certainty you feel when you watch a storm form on the horizon. He had built his entire position on fear and manipulation, and fear only lasts until someone stops being afraid. The day the tables finally turned wasn't dramatic in the way movies show. There was no loud confrontation, no dramatic speech, no sudden explosion. It happened the way corporate endings usually happen, quietly, efficiently, and with just enough distance to make it look like it was their decision, not yours. It started with an email, not a public announcement, not a warning, just a simple message from HR asking him to come to a meeting with leadership. No explanation, no details, just a time and a place. In the corporate world, that's the most terrifying kind of email, because it means someone else is controlling the narrative now. He walked into that meeting looking like he was still in control, like he still believed he could charm his way out of anything. He smiled, he tried to act calm, he even tried to make a joke, but the room didn't laugh. That's when I realized the cruelest thing about corporate power: it isn't taken away by a single event. It's taken away by a series of small truths that build up until they become undeniable. The meeting lasted longer than it should have. That's always a sign. When people talk longer, it's because they're trying to justify something. They were going over numbers, dates, decisions, email chains, his responses, his mistakes. And the more they spoke, the more it became clear that the truth wasn't just obvious. It was inescapable. He tried to defend himself, but his defense was weak, not because he was dumb, because he had been living in a bubble for so long that he didn't understand how the world worked outside his own manipulation. Meanwhile, I was at my desk, not watching, not waiting, not celebrating, just working, because I knew how this would end. He left the meeting without saying a word. He didn't walk out like a fired man. He walked out like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him had disappeared. The next morning, the office felt different. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. People smiled more. They walked more confidently. They spoke more openly. It wasn't because they were happy someone lost their job. It was because they were finally free from the pressure he'd put on them. Free from the constant fear of being humiliated. Free from the feeling that any mistake could become a weapon. Later that day, leadership called an all-hands meeting. The room was full. People whispered. Everyone wondered what was going to be said. The announcement was simple. He was being let go. No dramatic explanation. No public humiliation. No, he was a bad person. Just a statement of fact, delivered in a tone that made it clear this was a business decision, not a personal one. The way they said it made it feel final, and the finality of it was the real revenge, because he had spent months trying to make me feel worthless in front of everyone. He had tried to erase my value. He had tried to make me invisible. But the universe doesn't work that way. Corporate life doesn't work that way. The truth is that people who build their power on humiliation always lose. Not immediately. Not in a dramatic moment. But eventually, because the world eventually catches up to what they are. After the meeting, people came up to me quietly, not to gloat, not to celebrate, just to say, "I'm sorry you had to go through that. I'm proud of you for staying calm. Your work saved us." And that's when I realized the real shift wasn't that he was fired. The real shift was that I was no longer trapped in the role he had assigned me. I wasn't useless. I was unbreakable. And in a world where people try to crush you to feel powerful, the greatest revenge isn't making them suffer. It's becoming someone they can never control again. If you've ever been disrespected at work, if someone tried to make you feel useless, drop a comment and tell me what happened to you. Because I want to read your story, and I want you to know you're not alone. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe and turn on notifications.